Propaganda is a form of communication, often biased or misleading in nature, aimed at influencing and altering the attitude of a population towards some cause, position or political agenda in an effort to form a consensus to a standard set of belief patterns. Propaganda is information that is not impartial and used primarily to influence an audience and further an agenda, often by presenting facts selectively to encourage a particular synthesis, or using loaded messages to produce an emotional rather than a rational response to the information presented. While the term propaganda has acquired a strongly negative connotation by association with its most manipulative and jingoistic examples, propaganda in its original sense was neutral and could refer to uses that were generally positive, such as public health recommendations, signs encouraging citizens to participate in a census or election, or messages encouraging persons to report crimes to law enforcement. Etymology: propaganda is a modern Latin word, the gerundive form of propagare, meaning to spread or to propagate. Thus propaganda means that which is to be propagated. Originally this word derived from a new administrative body of the Catholic Church created in 1622, called the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, or informally simply propaganda. Its activity was aimed at propagating the Catholic faith in non-Catholic countries. From the 1790s, the term began being used also for propaganda in secular activities. The term began taking a pejorative connotation in the mid-19th century, when it was used in the political sphere. History. Types. Defining propaganda has always been a problem. The main difficulties have involved differentiating propaganda from other types of persuasion, and avoiding a biased approach. Garth Jowett and Victoria O'Donnell have provided a concise, workable definition of the term. Propaganda is the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. More comprehensive is the description by Richard Allen Nelson. Propaganda is neutrally defined as a systematic form of purposeful persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions, attitudes, opinions, and actions of specified target audiences for ideological, political or commercial purposes through the controlled transmission of one-sided messages via mass and direct media channels. A propaganda organization employs propagandists who engage in propagandism, the applied creation and distribution of such forms of persuasion. Both definitions focus on the communicative process involved, or more precisely, on the purpose of the process, and allow propaganda to be considered objectively and then interpreted as positive or negative behavior depending on the perspective of the viewer or listener. According to historian Zbigniew Zeman, propaganda is defined as either white, gray or black. White propaganda openly discloses its source. Gray propaganda is ambiguous or non-disclosed. Black propaganda purports to be published by the enemy or someone besides its actual origins. Propaganda shares techniques with advertising and public relations, each of which can be thought of as propaganda that promotes a commercial product or shapes the perception of an organization, person, or brand. In post-World War II, usage of the word propaganda more typically refers to political or nationalist uses of these techniques or to the promotion of a set of ideas. Propaganda was often used to influence opinions and beliefs on religious issues, particularly during the split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches. Propaganda has become more common in political contexts, in particular to refer to certain efforts sponsored by governments, political groups, but also often covert interests. In the early 20th century, propaganda was exemplified in the form of party slogans. Also in the early 20th century, the term propaganda was used by the founders of the nascent public relations industry to refer to their activities. This usage died out around the time of World War II, as the industry started to avoid the word, given the pejorative connotation it had acquired. Literally translated from the Latin gerundivus, things that must be disseminated. In some cultures the term is neutral or even positive, while in others, the term has acquired a strong negative connotation. The connotations of the term propaganda can also vary over time. For example, in Portuguese and some Spanish language-speaking countries, particularly in the Southern Cone, the word propaganda usually refers to the most common manipulative media, advertising. In English, propaganda was originally a neutral term for the dissemination of information in favor of any given cause. During the 20th century, however, the term acquired a thoroughly negative meaning in Western countries, representing the intentional dissemination of often false, but certainly compelling, claims to support or justify political actions or ideologies. This redefinition arose because both the Soviet Union and Germany's government under Hitler admitted explicitly to using propaganda favoring, respectively, communism and Nazism, in all forms of public expression, as these ideologies were repugnant to liberal Western societies. The negative feelings toward them came to be projected into the word propaganda itself. However, Harold Lasswell observed, as early as 1928, that propaganda has become an epithet of contempt and hate, and the propagandists have sought protective coloration in such names as Public Relations Council, Specialist in Public Education, Public Relations Advisor. Roderick Hindrey argues that propaganda exists on the political left and right, and in mainstream centrist parties. Hindrey further argues that debates about most social issues can be productively revisited in the context of asking, what is or is not propaganda? Not to be overlooked is the link between propaganda, indoctrination, and terrorism, counterterrorism. He argues that threats to destroy are often as socially disruptive as physical devastation itself. Propaganda also has much in common with public information campaigns by governments, which are intended to encourage or discourage certain forms of behavior. Again, the emphasis is more political in propaganda. Propaganda can take the form of leaflets, posters, TV and radio broadcasts, and can also extend to any other medium. In the case of the United States, there is also an important legal distinction between advertising and what the Government Accountability Office, an arm of the United States Congress, refers to as covert propaganda. The ease of data collection emerging from the IT revolution and a lack of control on the acquired data's use has led to the widespread implementation of workplace propaganda created much more locally, such as in schools, hospitals, local retail outlets and universities. The same article also notes of departure from the traditional methodology of propagandists, i.e., the use of emotionally provocative imagery to distort facts. Workplace propaganda is suggested to use distorted data to overrule emotion. For example, by providing rationales for ideologically driven pay cuts, etc. Journalistic theory generally holds that news items should be objective, giving the reader an accurate background and analysis of the subject at hand. On the other hand, advertisements evolved from the traditional commercial advertisements to include also a new type in the form of paid articles or broadcasts disguised as news. These generally present an issue in a very subjective and often misleading light, primarily meant to persuade rather than inform. Normally they use only subtle propaganda techniques and not the more obvious ones used in traditional commercial advertisements. If the reader believes that a paid advertisement is in fact a news item, the message the advertiser is trying to communicate will be more easily believed or internalized. Such advertisements are considered obvious examples of covert propaganda because they take on the appearance of objective information rather than the appearance of propaganda, which is misleading. Federal law specifically mandates that any advertisement appearing in the format of a news item must state that the item is in fact a paid advertisement. The propagandist seeks to change the way people understand an issue or situation for the purpose of changing their actions and expectations in ways that are desirable to the interest group. Propaganda, in this sense, serves as a corollary to censorship in which the same purpose is achieved, not by filling people's minds with approved information, but by preventing people from being confronted with opposing points of view. What sets propaganda apart from other forms of advocacy is the willingness of the propagandist to change people's understanding through deception and confusion rather than persuasion and understanding. The leaders of an organization know the information to be one-sided or untrue, but this may not be true for the rank-and-file members who help to disseminate the propaganda. Religion, more in line with the religious roots of the term, it is also used widely in the debates about new religious movements, both by people who defend them and by people who oppose them. The latter pejoratively call these NRMs cults. Anti-cult activists and Christian counter-cult activists accuse the leaders of what they consider cults of using propaganda extensively to recruit followers and keep them. Some social scientists, such as the late Jeffrey Haddon, and CESNUR-affiliated scholars accuse ex-members of cults, who became vocal critics on the anti-cult movement, of making these unusual religious movements look bad without sufficient reasons. Wartime propaganda is a powerful weapon in war. It is used to dehumanize and create hatred toward a supposed enemy, either internal or external, by creating a false image in the mind. This can be done by using derogatory or racist terms, avoiding some words, or by making allegations of enemy atrocities. Most propaganda wars require the home population to feel the enemy has inflicted an injustice, which may be fictitious or may be based on facts. The home population must also decide that the cause of their nation is just. Propaganda is also one of the methods used in psychological warfare, which may also involve false flag operations. The term propaganda may also refer to false information meant to reinforce the mindsets of people who already believe as the propagandist wishes. The assumption is that, if people believe something false, they will constantly be assailed by doubts. Since these doubts are unpleasant, people will be eager to have them extinguished, and are therefore receptive to the reassurances of those in power. For this reason, propaganda is often addressed to people who are already sympathetic to the agenda. This process of reinforcement uses an individual's predisposition to self-select agreeable information sources as a mechanism for maintaining control. Propaganda can be classified according to the source and nature of the message. White propaganda generally comes from an openly identified source, and is characterized by gentler methods of persuasion, such as standard public relations techniques and one-sided presentation of an argument. Black propaganda is identified as being from one source, but is in fact from another. This is most commonly to disguise the true origins of the propaganda, be it from an enemy country or from an organization with a negative public image. Grey propaganda is propaganda without any identifiable source or author. A major application of grey propaganda is making enemies believe falsehoods using straw arguments. As phase 1, to make someone believe A, one releases as grey propaganda, B, the opposite of A. In phase 2, B is discredited using some straw man. The enemy will then assume A to be true. In scale, these different types of propaganda can also be defined by the potential of true and correct information to compete with the propaganda. For example, opposition to white propaganda is often readily found and may slightly discredit the propaganda source. Opposition to grey propaganda, when revealed, may create some level of public outcry. Opposition to black propaganda is often unavailable and may be dangerous to reveal, because public cognizance of black propaganda tactics and sources would undermine or backfire the very campaign the black propagandists supported. Propaganda may be administered in insidious ways. For instance, Disparaging disinformation about the history of certain groups or foreign countries may be encouraged or tolerated in the educational system. Since few people actually double-check what they learn at school, such disinformation will be repeated by journalists as well as parents, thus reinforcing the idea that the disinformation item is really a well-known fact, even though no one repeating the myth is able to point to an authoritative source. The disinformation is then recycled in the media and in the educational system, without the need for direct governmental intervention on the media. Such permeating propaganda may be used for political goals, by giving citizens a false impression of the quality or policies of their country. They may be incited to reject certain proposals or certain remarks or ignore the experience of others. In the Soviet Union during the Second World War, the propaganda designed to encourage civilians was controlled by Stalin, who insisted on a heavy-handed style that educated audiences easily saw was inauthentic. On the other hand, the unofficial rumors about German atrocities were well-founded and convincing. Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights prohibits any propaganda for war as well as any advocacy of national or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence by law. Corporate propaganda refers to propagandist claims made by a corporation for the purpose of manipulating market opinion with regard to that corporation and its activities. Just as the use of these products and services can provide pluses which outweigh the minuses to society and individuals, their advocacy may function more positively than negatively. Common euphemisms for corporate propaganda are advertising and public relations. Workplace propaganda is used by employers directed at employees, often based upon distorted data utilized to justify ideologically driven decision-making processes. This differs from corporate propaganda as it is an internal process and has the potential to be found in small charities as well as in large market-driven corporations. Techniques. Common media for transmitting propaganda messages include news reports, government reports, historical revision, junk science, books, leaflets, movies, radio, television, and posters. Less common nowadays are letter-post envelopes, examples of which have survived from the time of the American Civil War. In principle, anything that appears on a poster can be produced on a reduced scale on a pocket-style envelope with corresponding proportions to the poster. The case of radio and television propaganda can exist on news, current affairs or talk show segments, as advertising or public service announce spots, or as long-running advertorials. Propaganda campaigns often follow a strategic transmission pattern to indoctrinate the target group. This may begin with a simple transmission such as a leaflet dropped from a plane or an advertisement. Generally, these messages will contain directions on how to obtain more information, via a website, hotline, radio program, etc. The strategy intends to initiate the individual from information recipient to information seeker through reinforcement, and then from information seeker to opinion leader through indoctrination. A number of techniques based in social psychological research are used to generate propaganda. Many of these same techniques can be found under logical fallacies, since propagandists use arguments that, while sometimes convincing, are not necessarily valid. Some time has been spent analyzing the means by which the propaganda messages are transmitted. That work is important, but it is clear that information dissemination strategies become propaganda strategies only when coupled with propagandistic messages. Identifying these messages is a necessary prerequisite to study the methods by which those messages are spread. Below are a number of techniques for generating propaganda.